Tonight, we're continuing after a week last week off due to storms and tornadoes with our series called Ascend, which focuses on the life of David. David is known as the man after God's own heart. After King Saul's complete failure of kingship, David is appointed to be king. Unfortunately, Saul is still king. And even though David has been anointed to be king, Saul is king. And so David is in this kind of in-between spot, much like you are. As a college student, you kind of know where your life may be going, hopefully. And if not, that's okay too. But you kind of have an idea of a major or maybe a job that you want, but you're not there yet. And that's kind of the scene that David is in. David knows what God has put in his heart to do, and yet somebody's in that job already. Somebody's in that spot. And how does he deal with that as a man after God's own heart? Tonight we're going to move into the fourth aspect of David's kingship. We've talked about the trials of David, how he faced Goliath, how he was a shepherd boy, and all of that culminated into his kingship. We talked about the relationships of David, how David had four primary relationships, capped off by a prophet. A prophet is somebody who legitimized his kingship and believed in him more than he believed in himself. We all need that kind of relationship in our lives. And the last time that we were together, we talked about the responsibility of David. When David took on responsibility for his world, for people around him, and for things that even though he was not the cause of, he felt it was in his power to do something about it. Tonight, we're talking about order. How do you bring order to your world around you? How do you bring order to the chaos that sometimes persists in your influence? How do you do that? And ultimately, what makes a good king? To illustrate this, I've got a scene from Game of Thrones. Let's watch together. Of these two characters that are discussing exactly what it means to be a good king. And they're met with a lot of different answers. A good king is going to be just. A good king is going to be strong, maybe holiness. And these are all things that you might attribute to somebody that's going to be a good king. The Bible, in the stories of kingship, struggle with this. They struggle with the idea of what is it that's going to make a good king. And David is named a man after God's own heart, and one assumes that David will be a good king. But what does it mean when David is a man after God's own heart, and he is known, Old and New Testament, even given some of the things that happened at the end of David's life, he is known as a good king. In fact, when it says, when the Jews are looking ahead to a Messiah that is going to come, they often say that one that is going to sit on the throne of David or reign in the city of David. This is an idea that is bigger than just, well, David was the ruler there. It is the idea that David was this amazing king that did so much, even with all of his faults. He was a good king. But what was it about David that made him a good king? Now, this could be a multi-week sermon series, but I'm going to try to give it to you briefly in one night. A good king, according to the Bible, is one that is going to be a person after God's own heart. To expand that even more, a good king, meaning one who is going to be after God's own heart, is one that embodies what is called the image of God. The image of God is the thing that you and I as humans, as any human, is imbued with. We are created in the image of God. Now, what does that mean? It does not mean that we look like God. That might come as a shock to you. It does not mean that we look like God. Instead, the image of God means that we share a co-creative spirit with God. It means that we have a co-creative ability, and we have that operative aspect of our lives. God says to Adam and Eve and to the first humans in Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, it says, "This is the world. Take it, reign over it, subdue it, reproduce, multiply, take care of the trees, plant, grow, take care, and create." And why is that important? Because God's self created and allowed things to grow. And God says, part of this image of God that I am placing in you is that you too will be a creator. But then in the chapters that follow, in the early chapters of Genesis, some of the oldest archetypal language, Genesis 1 through chapter 11, really, we get to see more things about this God. This is a God who not only creates, but this is a God who provides. This is a God that provides every piece of food and fruit and tree in the garden. A God that provides even when people are sinful. When they sin and they realize that they are naked in that chapter 2, what happens? God provides skins, provides clothing for them. This is not only a God that creates and a God that provides, but this is a God that is just. There is right, there is wrong, and God will hold people accountable. This is the story of Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy. This is the idea that there is a God who is just, and when people act justly, they will be on the right side of history. And when they act unjustly, they are going to be separated. They are going to be punished, and there will be a penalty for that. This is also a God, according to the book of Genesis and the story of Noah, who experiences deep empathy, lament, and regret. It's odd to say that God regrets anything, and yet right there in Genesis chapter 6, it says that God, seeing all the violence of the human race and all that humanity had become, God regretted making humanity and then sent a flood as a result of it, which some theologians have referred to as tears that God is weeping over humanity, flooding them with his sorrow. We've heard of God regretting other things. In fact, when Saul steps out of line not once, not twice, but 3 times as king, God rejects Saul, and what he says to Samuel is stirring. He says, I regret the day that I made Saul king. This is a God who regrets, who feels, who grieves. Even in the New Testament, Jesus wept, right? This is a God that creates, a God that provides. This is a God who is just, and this is a God who grieves, regrets, laments. This is also a God who exhibits wrath, and this is part of justice, a God that enacts wrath on those that oppose God. We see this in the war narratives and the history books of the Bible. This is a God who is known for wrath. And counter to that, this is a God who is known as love, a God who is compassionate, a God who is merciful. Now, what makes a good king? What makes a good king? Some would say strength and ferocity, wrath. Some would say a king who is in touch with the people, has empathy toward the people. Regret, grief, lament. Perhaps a good king is one that's going to create systems and structures. God is a creator. A good king is going to provide for his or her people. A good king is going to be compassionate. A good king is going to be just. The reality is, when we talk about what a good king is, or even what a good person is, a lot of times we have a tendency to lean into one of those things rather than the others. So sometimes in our lives we might say, well, we really respect a leader who is great and compassionate. Or we might say, we need a leader that is going to really clean house and enact, we would never use this word, enact some wrath, right? You might not ever want that unless you're on the receiving end of the business, and it's like, hey, we really need that business to clean house and enact some wrath. We sometimes want our leaders to create new initiatives, not just go along with the status quo. We want our leaders to provide some things. We want our leaders to be relatable, to regret, to empathize. We want all of these things at different times in our lives. The kingship narratives in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Scriptures, point to kings that lean too far into one of these at the cost of the other five. And because of that, those kings fail. Yet with David, we see one who, at least in the early days of his kingship, is able to balance those 6 attributes with such fluidity and such purpose. At times leaning on one attribute of the image of God, and at other times leaning on another as the situation calls for it. To live in the image of God is to act with the attributes of our divine King, and that we might bring order to chaos. Now, I use that phrase, order to chaos. Where does it come from? Order to chaos is something that's used in the Old Testament, especially Genesis chapter 1, when the world was formless and empty and there was the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. And it says that God said, "Let there be light." And the story, the saga, the epic of Genesis chapter 1, it is this incredible narrative of how God brings order from absolute disorder or chaos. This is what the Mesopotamians and the Babylonians and the Egyptians all talked about in their creation narratives. In the beginning, there was chaos. It was wild and uncertain, and God brought order to it. Now, in the same way, you and I are called to bring order to chaos. How do we do it? By enacting those attributes of God. We too must be creative. We too must provide where there is need. We too must mourn and regret and have empathy and sorrow at points in the world. We too must be just and do justice. We too must be compassionate, and at times we too must be wrathful, but never too far into one camp. Tonight I'm going to read a couple of stories where David experiences the same thing twice. He's dealing with Saul, a story so nice that they tell it twice, and yet David's response and reaction is different both times. I'm going to be reading from 1 Samuel chapter 24, and then I'm going to move a couple of chapters over. Here's what it says. As we left off last time, David is on the run from King Saul. Saul wants to kill him because, as the songs go, Saul has killed his thousands, but David his tens of thousands. So they are heralding David as a mighty warrior, and they're kind of like shrugging off Saul. He was yesterday's news, but David is awesome. Meanwhile, Saul is still on the throne. Here's what it says. Even as Saul returned from pursuing the Philistines, he was informed that David was in a nearby wilderness. So Saul took 3,000 men selected from all Israel, and they went to look for David and his soldiers near the rocks of the wild goats. He came to the sheep pens beside the road where there was a cave, and Saul went into the cave to use the restroom. Interesting. Meanwhile, David and his soldiers were sitting in the very back of that same cave. Okay, so they don't have a restroom or a porta potty, they go into a cave. You with me? So Saul is private. David's soldiers in the back of the cave, they say to him, "Hey, this is the day that the Lord spoke of when he promised to you, 'I will hand over your enemy to you, and you can do to him whatever you think best.'" So, David sees his opportunity, and from the back of the cave, he sneaks up to Saul, back turned using the restroom. And he sneaks up and he cuts off a corner of Saul's robe. And there's a lot that could be said about that in another sermon. But immediately, as soon as David's sword touched the tassel, the corner of that robe, David felt horribly that he had cut off the corner of Saul's robe. He went back to his men and he said, God forbid that I should do something like that to my master, the Lord's anointed, or lift my hand against him, because he is the Lord's anointed." Yeah, he's the king and he's trying to kill you, David. You've been blessed as the king, but David says, "I will not harm the Lord's anointed." That speaks to who David is. In the moment, David moves forward to step out in wrath. And immediately he is hit with sorrow and regret. And he retreats to the back of the cave. So David held his soldiers in check by what he said. They all wanted to kill him, but he would not let them attack Saul. And then Saul gathered himself, left the cave, and went on his way. Then David went out to the mouth of the cave, and he yelled after Saul, and he said, "My master, my king!" And Saul looked back, and David bowed low out of respect, which is insane because Saul has never given David respect since those songs had been sung. He's done nothing but throw spears at David. And David said to Saul, "Why do you listen to other people when they say that David wants to ruin you? Look, today with your own eyes you've seen that God himself handed you over to me in that cave, but I refused to kill you. I spared you, and I said I will not lift a hand against my master because he is the Lord's anointed. Look here, my protector. See the corner of your robe in my hand? I cut off the corner of your robe, but I did not kill you. So know now that I am not guilty of wrongdoing or rebellion. I haven't wronged you, but you are hunting me down. You're trying to kill me. So may the Lord judge between me and you. May the Lord take vengeance on you for me, but I will not lift a single finger against you." An old proverb says it best, "Evil deeds come from evildoers, but I won't lift a hand against you." So who is Israel's king coming after? Who are you chasing? A dead dog? A single flea? May the Lord be the judge and decide between you and me, and may God see what's happened, argue my case, and vindicate me against you. Now that's a bold thing to say to the current king. And yet, David's right. David had every chance to enact full wrath. He enacted a little bit of wrath, but he could have finished the job. Instead, he relented, and he chose to act on behalf of justice. God will be the judge between us. I will not be the judge, jury, and executioner to Saul. This is incredible restraint on David's part. And you can see some of the ways that he counteracts and counterbalances who Saul is. I like that story. Saul kind of comes up after this, and he's like, "Oh, I'm terrible, David. Oh my gosh, you were so much better than me." He goes on. I'll actually read a little bit of it. He says, "David, my son, is that your voice?" And then he broke into tears. And he told David, "You are far more righteous than I because you have treated me so generously, and I've treated you so terribly. Today you've told me all the good that you've done for me, how the Lord handed me over to you, but how you didn't kill me. When someone finds an enemy, do they send the enemy away in peace? May the Lord repay you with good for what you've done to me today. Now even I know that you will definitely become king, and Israel's kingdom will flourish in your hands. Because of that, make a solemn pledge to me by the Lord that you won't kill off my descendants after I'm gone, and that you won't destroy my name from my family lineage." So David made a pledge, and David and his soldiers went back to his fortress, and that should have been the end of their saga. But in chapter 26, here's what happens. Later, the Ziphites came to Saul at Gibeah, and they said to him, "Hey, David is hiding on Halkelah's hill, which faces Jeshimon." And so Saul got up, and he went to this Ziph wilderness to look for David there. He had 3,000 hand-picked soldiers, and Saul camped on Hilkiah's hill opposite Jeshimon, beside the road. But David stayed in the wilderness. When David learned that Saul had come after him into the wilderness, he sent spies this time and discovered that Saul had definitely shown up. So David got up and went to the place where Saul camped, and he saw the place where Saul and Abner, this is Saul's general, were sleeping. Now Saul was sleeping inside the camp with the troops camped all around him. And David asked Ahimelech the Hittite and Joab's brother Abishai, "Who will go down to the camp with me to see Saul?" "I'll go down with you," one answered. And so David and Abishai approached the troops at night and found Saul lying there asleep in the camp with the spear stuck in the ground by his head. Abner and the army were sleeping all around him. Now, think of how vulnerable Saul is at this point. Abishai said to David, "God has handed your enemy over to you today. Let me pin him to the ground with my spear. One stroke is all that I need. I will not need a second. That's pretty, wow. David said to Abishai, hey, don't kill him. Don't kill him. No one can lift a hand against the Lord's anointed and go unpunished. As surely as the Lord lives, it will be the Lord who will strike him down, or his day will come and he will die, or he'll fall in battle and be destroyed. But the Lord forbid that I ever lift a hand against the Lord's anointed. But go ahead, take the spear, because he loves to throw it at me. Take the spear and the water jug that were there by Saul's head, and let's go. So they did. They grabbed the spear, they grabbed the water jug, and no one saw them. No one knew they left. No one knew any of this, that they were even there, until they woke up. All of them remained asleep because a deep sleep from the Lord had come over them. So David crossed to the other side and stood on top of a hill with considerable distance between them, just in case Saul got another spear. And then David shouted to the army and to Abner, Ner's son, Abner, aren't you going to answer me? Saul's general. Who are you to shout at the king? Abner asked. David answered Abner, you are a man, aren't you? And you have no equal in Israel, right? Then why haven't you kept watch over your master the king? One of the soldiers came to kill your master the king. What you've done is terrible. As surely as the Lord lives, all of you are dead men because you didn't keep close watch over your master, the Lord's anointed. But look around. Where are the king's spear and the water jug that were by his head? And Saul recognized David's voice and again said, David, my son, is that your voice? David said, yeah, it is. Why? Why is my master chasing me again? Right? What have I done that's so wrong that I'm guilty of? My master the king, please listen to what I have to say. If it is the Lord who's incited you against me, then let him accept an offering. But if human beings have convinced you to do it, then let them be cursed before God, because they have now driven me off, keeping me from sharing in the Lord's inheritance. Go, they tell me, worship other gods. Don't let my blood spill on the ground because of the Lord's presence, because the king of Israel has come out looking for me like a single flea among the mountains in the desert. And again, Saul said, I have sinned. David, come back. You considered my life precious today. I won't harm you again. I've acted foolishly and made a huge mistake. He said, here's the king's spear. Allow one of your servants to come and get it. And remember, God rewards every person for their righteousness and loyalty, and I wasn't willing to lift a hand against you today, even though God handed you over to me. And just as I considered your life valuable, may God consider my life valuable, and may he deliver me from all trouble. And Saul said, bless you, David. You'll accomplish much and certainly succeed. And David left, and Saul left. But then David thought, one day I am going to be destroyed by Saul. And so David went into hiding for quite a while, until Saul died. Now, these two stories show us David's different perceptions in how he's going to enact order to the chaos that Saul has brought to his life. He's not going to take matters into his own hands. His guards and soldiers and generals are all saying, David, it's your chance. Do this. But David is not appealing or inquiring of the wisdom of men and women. David is inquiring of the Lord's mind, of the Lord's opinion, of the Lord's will. In the moment that he began to enact wrath, when God said no, justice, compassion, empathy, provision, the second he did that, he was overcome with guilt and sorrow. So, why do I share this with you? You may never be king, but you are called to bear the image of God. We, as the image bearers, must seek the wisdom to know when to lean into one side of God's nature and attributes versus another. There is a time for creation, and there is a time for provision. There is a time for weeping and a time for joy, as it says in Ecclesiastes. There is a time for justice, and sometimes justice means wrath, and sometimes justice means compassion. But God gives the wisdom to know the difference. You cannot gain the wisdom to know the difference, however, if you do not have a relationship with God. If you do not have a relationship with God, it is as though you are a blind person just trying to feel your way out, to say, okay, this feels right at this moment, or this feels right over here, but occasionally you may get it right, but at the end of the day, you are taking shots in the dark. A relationship with God allows you to say, okay, this season of chaos in my life is about to overwhelm me, but instead of just like feeling my way through it, I'm consulting the one whose image I bear. So God, what do I do? God, should I create something new? Should I provide something here? Should I just lament and mourn and be regretful and let that take its place in my life? Is there justice that you want me to do? And if so, should I enact wrath and anger? Or should I enact love, mercy, and compassion? And you might say, when in the world would God ever say to enact anger? Well, this is the Jesus who not only forgave and healed the sinners, but this is also the Jesus that overturned tables. But it's a righteous anger. It's not a retaliatory, toddler-esque tantrum. And I share this with you because the kingdom of God, in the economy of God, our decision-making is held to a higher and different standard than the world around us. And friends, when I make leadership decisions for my own life on behalf of you, on behalf of ministries that I serve as a professor or whatever else, these are the 6 or so attributes that I try to balance out. And I certainly have advisors that come to me, hey, you should do this, or are you going to let that happen, or da-da-da, and I just have to tune it out. Some of you, unfortunately, are some of the ones that I've tuned out. But I want to tell you this, I haven't gotten it all right, but I try to connect with God and do right by the one whose image I bear. My hope is that one day, not just for me, but for every pastor and leader that you've ever had, you might look back and you might say, they did embody the image of God. This was a person after God's own heart, at the very least. That, I think, leads to a life of no regrets. And if there's nothing else that I could impart to you, I want you to live a life of no regrets. Seek wisdom. Seek God's nature and God's image in your life. And bring order to chaos in the world around you. And you will be like David. As it says in Psalm 78:72, a long psalm. And David shepherded his people with integrity of heart and skillfulness of hand. That, my friends, is what makes a good king, and it is what makes a good leader. Let's pray together. God, we give you thanks because you are the model for us. You're the one that shows us in the midst of our chaos what is right and what is wrong, what is good and helpful and fruitful, and what is damaging. Help us to bring order to the chaotic disorder in our lives. Would you help us to tap into these attributes that you have imbued to us in right measure for the sake of your kingdom. We love you. It is in your name. Amen.